Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, in our ongoing study in the very first church history by Eusebius, published somewhere around AD 263 to 339. We're going to take a look at pages 57 to 89. We're going to take a look at the apostles. And we'll begin with block 1. Let's take a look at the Jerusalem apostles. And we read that Matthias was selected to replace Judas. And then 7 individuals were appointed deacons, led by Stephen. And James the Just was elected Bishop of Jerusalem. James the Just was elected Bishop of Jerusalem. Now in Acts 12, we read that after the resurrection, the Lord imparted gnosis on James the Just, John, and Simon Peter. Also, early on, Stephen's martyrdom was followed by a great persecution of the church that resulted in the diaspora. The disciples were scattered, except the 12, throughout Judea and Samaria. But they were only preaching the gospel to the Jews. Philip, however, did go to Samaria, and there was a Simon Magus, a magician, who feigned belief in Christ and was baptized. Also, an officer from Ethiopia traveled to hear Philip's preaching. Another Gentile. He became the first converted Gentile. He then returned to Ethiopia to preach the gospel himself. That fulfilled Psalm 68 that reads, Ethiopia shall stretch out its hands to God. Now, in note 2, we're going to take a look at the Roman Emperor Tiberius. Christ's resurrection was becoming talked about and famous everywhere. Pilate communicated to Tiberius, the emperor, the story of Jesus' resurrection. But when Tiberius presented this communication to the Roman Senate, they rejected the narrative and any inference that Jesus was Son of God, because to them, someone could only be proclaimed a god by a senatorial decree. We're told by Eusebius, though, that Tiberius did receive the report in a positive way and was curious about the entire matter. So he didn't, Tiberius, according to Eusebius, Tiberius did not oppose the church, and it continued to spread. And during this time, Cornelius of Caesarea was converted through Peter's ministry. Gentiles at Antioch were converted also, and the name Christian, Christianos, did emerge. So, something, and I was curious about that, but Eusebius says that the Emperor Tiberius was curious about these reports concerning Jesus of Nazareth. So, I think that's an interesting point. But it doesn't last long, because we move on to Caligula. After a reign of 22 years, Tiberius died, and Caligula, his nephew, assumed the throne. And it is believed, by the way, that Caligula murdered Tiberius. He murdered his uncle to gain the throne. That's the tradition. He then appointed Herod Agrippa king over Judea. During this time, Philo of Alexandria grew in fame as a scholar. Philo traveled to Rome with a delegation to approach the emperor with a petition for Alexandria. He was mocked by Caligula and dismissed and he barely got away with his life. Caligula hated the Jews and forced his statue to be erected in Jewish synagogues. He attempted to convert the Jewish Jerusalem temple into a temple honoring him as the god Jupiter incarnate. What that did was start an uprising. It started a violent revolution, a stirring up of factions in Jerusalem, and it became a powder keg of skirmishes. Thanks to Caligula's arrogance, he actually was stirring up Jerusalem, and I'm sure blaming it on the governor instead of himself. Now, if you look at note 4, it's interesting that Caligula didn't last long. In less than 4 years, Rome had enough of Caligula, and Claudius became the new emperor. But a great famine broke out at this time. In Acts 11, we read that aid was sent to Judea by way of Paul and Barnabas. At the time, King Herod Agrippa had James, the brother of John, beheaded. That's in Acts 2. Divine justice came down on the king for this crime. In Acts 12, he was giving a speech in Caesarea when he was struck down by an angel, later to die by being eaten by worms. But we do have the martyrdom of James, the brother of John, by Herod Agrippa. So Jerusalem was in turmoil under Caligula, and it was under famine after that. Let's move on to block 2. Let's take a look at Alexandria and Rome. And we read that after Simon Peter exposed Simon Magus in Judea, he fled to Rome. He led many astray there with his sorcery. Justin Martyr wrote of this in his defense of doctrine. Simon, a Samaritan, worked wonders in Claudius's reign, who followed Caligula. He was deemed a god in Rome. They erected a statue of him at the river Tiber. Irenaeus also testified to this heresy in his book Against Heresies. A woman named Helen of Tyre traveled with Simon. Simon and Helen were worshipped with incense and sacrifices. But then Peter showed up in Rome. Peter's preaching and power shut down all of Simon's heresy. The people of Rome pleaded with Mark, who was, remember, he's the right-hand man of Simon Peter. They pleaded with Mark to please write a record of Simon Peter's gospel and leave it with them. Thus came about the Gospel of Mark. Now, in note 2, let's take a look at Philo in the early monastic life in Alexandria. Philo came to Rome again during Claudius's reign in order to speak with Simon Peter. This time he was approaching Simon Peter, not the emperor, and shared the version of monastic life they had forged in Alexandria. They were called the Order of the Therapeutae, because their order was dedicated to the healing of souls. Their practices included renunciation of property, selling off of possessions, and giving the proceeds to the order. They lived in a separate district outside the walls of Alexandria. And each home had a sanctuary area dedicated to spiritual life. But the key thing, they interpreted the scriptures entirely as allegories, so it was really a false doctrine. They interpreted everything as allegory. Virtue meant self-control. Philo's works included allegories of the sacred laws, problems and solutions in Genesis and Exodus by using allegory, and then separate works on specific problems. His works were accepted into the Roman libraries. So Jerusalem had their Qumran monastic community. Alexandria had their order of the Therapeutae, their therapeutic monastic community outside their city. So Jerusalem had theirs at Qumran, and Alexandria had theirs with the monastic order following Philo and allegorical interpretation of scriptures. But it's interesting that we see this desire to live in a more pure way, because in Jerusalem they believed that the faith had been contaminated by Roman influence. I mean, obviously because of Caligula's statue is showing up everywhere. So they started their own monastic type community in Qumran. Now in Alexandria, similar issues were a problem, where pagan elements were creeping into the church life, so they desired their own monastic type separate existence also. So those type of things did emerge very early in church history. According to Eusebius, definitely by mid 3rd century. Now let's move on to note block 3 and look at the reign of Claudius, Nero, and Vespasian. And all you got to do is say Nero, and you already know of the horror that we're going to anticipate here. But whenever we get into that string of emperors, you have to remember our study in the book of Revelation and the emperors that began. Remember the 6 that began with Caligula. All those that had a beast-like nature. So in block 3, the reign of Claudius and Nero. Claudius, he appointed Herod Agrippa II as king and Felix as governor. He ruled for 13 years and died, succeeded by Nero. Under Nero, Felix remained governor, but violent quarrels broke out between the priests of the temple. They divided into violent factions, and sustenance was even cut off to the lesser priests, which became impoverished. Justice was completely vanquished in Jerusalem. And then you had zealot bandits in Jerusalem who murdered victims in broad daylight using concealed daggers. Jonathan, the high priest, appointed by the governor, in other words, a Roman-appointed high priest, was murdered by these zealots. And at this time, an Egyptian false prophet entered the city and stirred up a revolutionary group of about 30,000 who gathered at the Mount of Olives. Before they could revolt, Felix attacked and killed most of them. The Egyptian fled with a few men. And that is where we get this reference in Acts 21, where Paul is questioned as to if he was part of the stirring up of that revolt. Now, note 2, Paul sent to Rome and placed on house arrest. Festus replaced Felix as governor. Paul was tried before Festus and he appealed to Rome. Paul spent 2 years in Rome under house arrest. During this time, he wrote to Timothy, and he told Timothy he was rescued from the lions of Nero's brutal horror circus, but his martyrdom was soon to come. Now, the martyrdom of James the Just, we've discussed this before, but we have confirmation of it here from Eusebius. We know about James the Just, but after Paul was transported to Rome, the Jews turned their hatred toward James the Just. Festus had recently died, so the city was temporarily without a governor. They seized James and demanded that he publicly deny his faith in Christ. He did just the opposite and confessed Jesus as Lord. He was thrown down from the roof of the temple, stoned, still didn't die, and then clubbed to death. He had remained faithful to the temple prayers even after becoming the bishop of Jerusalem. So he was showing up in the temple, praying 3 times a day. He was known as a just and righteous man because he did pray vigorously 3 times a day on his knees. And that was causing Jewish leaders to convert. They would see him and be impressed by his righteousness, and they were beginning to convert to Christianity. That caused this incident. The scribes and the Pharisees took him to the roof of the temple. The question was put to him, what does the door of Jesus mean? He answered, it means he's the Son of Man, sitting in heaven at the right hand of God. And the crowd below rejoiced loudly. This angered the scribes and Pharisees. They quoted the Wisdom of Solomon verse that says, remove the just man, they cast him from the roof. I didn't know this, James was buried right where he died, just outside the temple. And in the mid-3rd century, his gravestone was still there. The Jews came to believe that the siege of Jerusalem under Vespasian was due to God's punishment for the murder of James the Just. That, they believed, was God's punishment. That's why they were under siege by Rome, why they suffered, because of this horrible, horrible murder of James the Just. Vespasian brought God's punishment. Now, persecution under Nero, we've heard a lot about that already, but Nero committed many murders. He murdered his mother, he murdered his brothers, he murdered his wife while she was pregnant. He kicked his pregnant wife to death, killing the baby, killing the mother, his wife. He was the first emperor to be declared enemy of the deity. He sentenced Paul and Peter both to martyrdom. Peter was crucified upside down. Paul was beheaded under Nero. Jewish war broke out with Rome. Florus was appointed governor in the 12th year of Nero's reign. Florus was brutal, just like Nero. He persecuted Jews and Christians alike. He didn't care. And he caused a revolt of the Jews. And there were corpses just laying in the city streets, not buried. And the victims included old men, women, and children. That's how vicious this governor, Florus, was. So we think of Nero. Well, Nero had a governor that went right along with him. Nero and Florus both were brutal, cruel rulers. We always think of Pontius Pilate, but under Nero, Florus was appointed governor, and he was extremely cruel, just like Nero. But we get a look at some of the first apostles and the way that Jerusalem was really in turmoil most of the time. There was persecution in the early church, and there were skirmishes, there were a great deal of violence. There were zealots who carried daggers. There was so much political uproar that Jerusalem was a powder keg, a difficult place to rule, and governors got replaced frequently, and emperors became more insane and more cruel, and they appointed likewise cruel governors under their rule. But we do see the Alexandria monastic community evolved too in this lesson. So Jerusalem had their Qumran, and Egypt had their monastic community outside the city walls of Alexandria as well. The Therapeutae, they had the community of the Therapeutae, the order of the Therapeutae. Qumran community in Jerusalem, Therapeutae community in Egypt, outside Alexandria. So we get great additional content here from Eusebius. That's going to wrap up pages 57 to 89, chapter 2. We're going to pick up next time in chapter 3.